Hello and welcome to this episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast, brought to you by Novus Strategy and Consulting with Pete Gatenby and myself, Chris Williams. As you can see in today's episode, we are outside in the glorious weather of the UK, and we thought we'd take full advantage of it in moving our studio outside for the day. Now, this episode isn't about the weather though, it's actually about two important topics: investment versus impact and ownership versus access, and how this impacts you and your organisation within the home buying sector on your digital transformation and, importantly, speed. So let's get into it. So investment versus impact,
yes.
Ownership versus access. We've been involved in a number of things this year, in truth, both of us in different organisations, where this has been critically important to accelerating digital transformations. We're going to break this down into two parts. The first part will do the investment versus impact, and then we'll talk about ownership versus access. Investment versus impact. Mm-hmm. Pete, quick 360, 1 minute introduction. What is it about? Why is it important?
So investment versus impact, dead simple. It's a 2x2 framework that we use a lot and champion here at Novus. Very much used to measure different projects that you might use on your to accelerate any form of digital transformation within your organisation. And how it works is really simple. We measure the impact, low to high, versus the investment level, low to high. So any kind of project that you're considering, you would therefore place a score of low to high investment or low to high impact, and then map it against the other projects that you might be considering.
Yeah, makes sense. And this is important for a number of reasons. At a high level, we talk about it as a project level.
Yep.
Businesses, whether you, whatever role you play in the home buying ecosystem, lender, law firm, whatever, you're going to have technology projects that are in flight, or technology projects that you want to spin up in this year, quarter. Mm-hmm. But you've got to understand what impact those projects are going to have to get a priority in. And most companies would be doing some level of that kind of work. That said, if we take it a layer down and we now start to talk about the importance of speed, this is really important. And just before I hand back to you to talk about that in terms of taking it down that next layer, I think it'd probably be worth pointing out that here now, end of July 2024, this industry is in its second phase of digital transformation. It's been through a very vertical phase. We're now in the horizontal phase. We've waxed lyrical about this before, so we won't go into the detail of that. But fundamentally, the maturity exists within this market to accelerate at a significant pace. And the important message here is why these two topics are really interesting that we're talking about today and vitally important, is that if you are not assessing that investment versus impact, you're probably slowing yourselves down quite significantly in terms of features that you're rolling out on product, what are the next things to be looking at, and if you are slow and you are not moving quick enough, you're going to get caught out, because this industry now is really beginning to ramp up pace in terms of where it's going. I'm thinking specifically for lenders here and what's happening now, but also incumbent vendors and how they interoperate across this. So, but just that's an important point I wanted to make. Going back to the original piece though, we go a layer down from project. What does that layer down look like, and why is that important?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you start to break down any project or large program of work, within that there's often numerous work streams that need to happen at the same time, of which you're going to have conflicting time investment, monetary investment, etc., etc. And so we need a method for knowing where to focus our attention, and that's very much where this methodology comes in. And so if you take, I don't know, a large program of artificial intelligence, something that obviously I'm involved in a lot at the moment, the question's often, right, we've got all of these different work streams, how do we know what we should do first? They're all going to form perhaps part of a large program of work, but what should we do first? And so we know that there's certain elements that you can build probably a quick proof of concept about. You can pull a team together quite quickly to test a concept and start to perhaps build something that can be tested within the organisation really, really quickly. And so the investment there would be much lower, but it might have a really high impact in terms of proving the concept, or actually, if you can deploy it into the live environment, you're starting to get those returns really quickly for the organisation as a whole, versus something that might have quite a large investment overhead. You might be trying to train a model on reams of data, and you've got to collect all that data. There's almost pre-programs that you've got to do before you can actually get onto that, as it might be around your data lakes or getting things organised in the right way, then that level of investment and that level of investment that's needed to get what might be a really high impact program off the ground is going to be much higher.
So I mean, essentially what we're saying here is that it's really important that you're defining that pathway. Organisations tend to get caught up in this almost planning phase, and planning's great to a certain extent, but there's not a lot of value in too much planning. There's a certain bit of value in setting things out and being more specific about this. I think particularly in larger organisations, their investment models are not congruent with an agile way of working.
Yep.
And so they can often be caught out because they're trying to create or develop a business case that fits a particular financial modelling requirement that the business needs in order to sign off on said programme of work. And therefore they're trying to forecast out and out and out and out. Now that's not supportive of innovation in truth. And so using these types of 2x2 really simple little models to deliver a pathway is actually a really good way to move from where people are or organisations are now to kind of not missing out on this curve of acceleration and speed is what we're essentially saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I mean, speed's of the essence here. I mean, I can't emphasise it enough. Is like speed matters a lot.
Absolutely. And look, we're not saying here that you shouldn't plan.
Yeah.
But planning only becomes valuable if you ever get to the implementation stage. It's a cost centre.
Or testing the hypothesis, really.
Yeah,
isn't it?
exactly. And so until you get to the point of testing the hypothesis, you're investing time, effort, sometimes money in the planning phase before you can actually realise any of that investment. And so if you can move from the planning phase into a testing phase quickly, then you're going to realise that value much quicker. Now, I want to caveat this massively because there is a time for planning, absolutely. And so if you're embarking on large architectural changes within an organisation, they need to be considered because they're going to be touching other elements of the business that might be core business systems and core platforms that need to be considered. If they aren't planned in the correct way from a solutioning standpoint, then you're gonna have issues further down the line. So there is a place for planning, but not too much planning. It needs to be balanced against the ability to deliver things and test things and get things into market, whether that's proof of concept or whether that's a full product.
Yeah. Let's talk about ownership versus access, because as we segue from that 2x2 model, and in summary what we're saying here is that wherever you sit in the ecosystem, there's an opportunity to accelerate innovation, and you should be innovating and testing, whether that's with your own technology teams or partnering with vendors and suppliers in industry to be able to kind of start to really impact the experience or the user experience within the home buying ecosystem and improve that kind of singular KPI that everyone can agree on, which is the time to a property completion. How do we get that down, and how can digital use it? Using that 2x2 of investment versus impact, very simply you can begin to plot out what this is going to be look like. And investment isn't always necessarily capital, it can be time, so on and so forth. But as we move on from that, the next one, ownership versus access, this is all about the implementation. And we want to talk about it in that context, because the implementation phase often becomes an area where organisations need to look at how do we go from concept to cash, how do we scale at what we're doing. And there's a number of kind of vendors in this industry that are probably in a scale phase really, but they're having to experiment at pace and then move into scale. There are also incumbent players across the lender market and other areas of this industry where they are equally having to start to look at how they're going to go from what it is that they're doing to then moving into a scalable arena. So ownership versus access becomes critically important here. And in the context of what we're saying, what we mean is, do you want to be owning your IP? Do you want to be bringing that in as software as a service? Is it about owning the people that are going to be, as in the teams are going to be your delivery teams employed, or can you bring in contract resource to help scale this? We're talking about that, and this is a really important area. And again, another area where we see significant slowdown because people get caught up, especially when it's sort of resource augmentation, because they're not really following an augmentation strategy that actually is congruent with getting to where it is they want to get to at pace. Give us your kind of take on ownership versus access, Pete, when it comes to resource augmentation, and kind of let's talk about the Novus approach to this.
So when we're advising any of our clients, the only thing that is ever true for all of our clients is that it's very much a blended approach, in the fact that every single organisation we work with have different requirements. Why do we often recommend a blended approach is because we want clients to own the intellectual property of what they're building and the programs of work of which they're involved in. But we also recognise in almost every single one of those organisations that they have critical gaps within their delivery teams, or they might not even have delivery teams focused on what it is that they need to deliver at that time.
So these might be subject matter experts, particular tech stacks, whatever.
Absolutely. Sometimes they don't even recognise what tech skills are needed, and therefore there's a gap straight away. And so with every single one of our clients, it's always a blended approach, working alongside their current technology delivery teams, whether that's internal or even external partners, but then bolstering that with, temporary specialised resource to fill those gaps.
So, I mean, essentially what we're saying here is the fact that all organisations will have some level of gap as they go through these transformation journeys. We're talking about accelerating those transformation journeys and things being fast, speed, scalability. Scalability ultimately will come from having the right people in the right seats at the right time. You can't necessarily do that straight out of the gate. If you want to go and hire those people, specifically talking about resource augmentation and talent in particular seats with particular SME knowledge and experience, it takes time to hire that. What we tend to do is what we're saying is we'll tend to kind of parachute specific resource in, help do the knowledge transfer, the KT into their squads, get the necessary things in place, and then gradually begin to roll that resource out. That's what accelerates things. So when we look at kind of ownership versus access, what we're talking about there is getting access to the right people at the right time, and then bringing that into that level of ownership at the right time for high value. But it is all about scalability, isn't it? Is what we're saying.
Yeah, scalability and the right people doing the right thing. Yeah. So placement of the people within the squad and the jobs to be done.
Let's turn to this from an intellectual property standpoint, because for some organisations, it's not going to make commercial sense for them to kind of go and build something when they could essentially buy it in. And I'm talking specifically, application services.
Yeah. Even core banking platforms, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what we're seeing now is across the industry, what we're seeing is this convergence now. And there's a lot more collaboration that's coming in. And we saw this in telecommunications way back when, where there was a convergence of technologies, and vendors and suppliers actually became much more interoperable because they recognised that, well, actually the swim lane that we're in, by leveraging what's left and right of us, essentially what we can do is leverage our distribution and begin to kind of scale.
The boundaries began to become blurry, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think we're at this stage now, most definitely in this industry sector, where that opportunity is very clear, it's very specific, and it's very opportunistic. And I think those that get it are really going to be able to, I'll use that word again, I won't overuse it, scale quicker, but actually really have a big impact on the industry as a whole in terms of the customer experience. Yeah. So that ownership versus access piece for me is critically important, from actually assessing what it is that you should be building, where you've got your own technology teams and you can actually have that impact and you can have that intellectual property and ownership. But it's also about saying, well, we're looking left and right and saying, well, what else can we do? How else can we leverage other technology applications, making ourselves accessible to those vendors, to those prop techs or whatever, to be able to kind of make an impact and get that plugged into us. Are we working that way? Because that's the difference between ownership versus access. Yep. And if you can leverage the access element of that, you can move at a much, much faster pace.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So let's make this really specific then. When we start talking about access versus ownership from a technology standpoint, what's a really good example that we've seen recently?
We can't talk about specifics in terms of obviously clients and things like that, but what we can say is that if you look across the industry sector, what we're seeing now is the opportunity with the likes of open data standards and the likes of the OPDA and the great work that's being done there and in other areas, are ultimately how collaboration can be enabled. And this is a classic example of accessing applications, accessing services all around you. So let's look at it from two aspects. If you're a prop tech in this industry sector, it would be ideal if you could have access to the distribution of, incumbent players
Yep.
who are already in market. So it would make sense for you to collaborate and have standards that you adhered to and operated to that were cross industry or cross sector. If you look at the other side, if you're an incumbent player in this market, whether you're a lender, law firm, whatever, and you've got access to customers, you've got distribution, wherever you sit in that ecosystem, it's incredibly advantageous equally for you to start to look around and think, well, actually, how can we start to kind of bring certain things together in order to leverage that distribution so that we can do and have a great impact. So let's look at lenders specifically, because they are in a fantastic position to really influence and impact what's happening in this sector at the moment and massively improve customer experience. We know there's lots of lenders, we talk to a lot of them, that are really keen to improve the home buying journey, not just from the perspective of reducing that time, the transaction time, but actually improving the customer experience overall. You know, how can they do that? A lot of them have got legacy stacks, a lot of them have got legacy technologies, but actually we can see that, particularly in sort of the building society arena, rather than going down big re-platforming, they're kind of looking at things from an application standpoint and looking at different banking platforms, origination platforms, and how they can necessarily sit that together. That's massively underway. Not only is it underway, but as you look beyond that, they're starting to look at, well, how do we leverage the other people in the industry and all other services that they've written, other applications that they've got that can vastly improve the experience of a borrower. How can we do that? And they're asking those sorts of questions. So there's a classic example of, look, whatever side you sit on, whether you're an incumbent player and you've got access and distribution, but maybe you're a bit slower because of your technology stacks and legacy and all the other constraints that come along with that, but you can do but you've got the access, versus a prop tech that might be coming into market, doesn't necessarily have distribution, but has got a great piece of software, whatever it is, that can have an impact. It's all about bringing that together, and that's a classic example of really how to look at this sort of stuff, in my view. So that concludes this episode of the Digital Disruption podcast. As ever, thanks for tuning in. Please do like, follow and share not just this episode, but the podcast as a whole. And if you've got any specific questions from this episode or any others that we've had, don't hesitate to get in touch with Pete or myself via the usual channels. But for now, thanks for joining us on the outside bright sunny day. We'll probably be back in our normal studio because it'll be raining again in the next couple of weeks. But for now, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.